Welcome to Next Gen PA. My name is Samuel Pimentel, and today I'm joined with my co-host,
Michelle Engert.
And as well, we're joined with a special guest today, John Cole. He's a journalist for Penn Capital Star, as well as having worked for the Northeast Times, Politics PA, and PCN, reporting on many of the local, state, and federal elections in Pennsylvania. He's a Temple graduate and is based out of the wonderful brotherly love city of Philadelphia. So we are so grateful to have him here today, and I'm really excited to ask you some questions. And actually, I'm excited to start by talking about your most recent article on the bipartisan legislation that was passed through the House Agricultural and Rural Affairs Committee, which goal was to establish a Rural Revitalization Commission, which would help study the population decline seen in Pennsylvania rural communities. And I'm curious to what you think the effects of a commission like this could look like, and if it would help maybe raise awareness in the state to the quarter population in rural areas.
So again, first off, thank you for having me. I appreciate joining you today. That's an interesting piece of legislation. So again, it was last week. The House Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee announced that out of their committee, in a bipartisan fashion, they moved forward a proposal that essentially they want to have a commission to get a group of leaders together, so elected officials and those leaders in the rural regions of the state, to essentially conduct a study to, I think in their mind, try their best to essentially stop the and unfortunately, in rural parts of Pennsylvania right now, you recognize that there is a population loss. It is not keeping up with the more urban centers of the state. And what that means for the future of rural Pennsylvania, there's projections by 2050. I mean, while the southeast region of the state, in particular some of the rural areas, the urban centers will be increasing population, while the projections conducted via I think it was Penn State, mentioned that it looks like the rural parts of the region will be losing population within that same time period. So I think rural leaders on both sides of the aisle might add, this is not just a Democrat or Republican issue. This is something that rural leaders across the Commonwealth are trying to get out ahead of it now. They're already realizing that they're losing population as we speak and not keeping up pace with the urban centers. So I think their ultimate goal is that trying to get a collection of people from, again, different industries, different levels of government to try to have a dialogue to see what are the best practices to not only keep rural Pennsylvania afloat, but make it thrive once again.
I'm curious as to if there have been any studies you're aware of that have really come down to the root cause of this, and whether this is just a national movement of people moving to more urban centers, or if there's something specifically within the Commonwealth that could help explain this population decline.
That's a very interesting question, because they even alluded to it during the press conference afterwards, that this isn't just a Pennsylvania-specific issue. I think we recognize in rural parts of the country that this is happening. So this isn't just a PA-specific issue. However, a commission like this, at least from what the representatives have said, should this get across the finish line, because again, I want to just remind the audience that it's not as if this commission is formally through yet. It passed one House committee. You know what I mean? There's multiple levels of government has to go through to finally get across the finish line and to become law. So this is, again, as of now, a proposal. But it did cross a hurdle, which was the House Agriculture and Rural Affairs Committee. Their next goal, of course, would be to get it across for a vote in front of the full House and to get passed there. Then, of course, you need the Senate to approve it and then the governor to sign. But thus far, since it's a bipartisan effort, I think, at least from those that were discussing it, they seem rather optimistic. And they mentioned that, again, this is not just a PA-specific issue, but a commission like this, should it happen, they think there's not other states really doing this. So it seems like Pennsylvania maybe could be a model for other states. Again, should this get across the finish line and be enacted, and if it's successful, maybe other states will piggyback off of this to try to replicate it. But again, that remains to be determined. We're still, I would say, somewhat early in the process to see what kind of effects it will have and should it actually get formally approved.
This isn't really a topic I know too much about, but I'm wondering if they're looking at like the education piece in that as well, because lots of school districts within especially rural parts of Pennsylvania are struggling when it comes to providing good education for their students, and I'm wondering if they're looking at that in tandem with other initiatives to sort of maybe keep people in the rural parts of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so again, I can't speak from their perspective, of course, because I'm not one of the lawmakers on that. But I will say to that point, education was discussed. It seemed as though they made the pitch from them was that it wasn't just essentially one thing to look at. I think it's a culmination of issues. If you want a region to thrive, whether it be urban, suburban, or rural, you need a combination of sectors working together. And I think education is an important piece to that. I think if you want someone to stay in a certain part of the state, you need to make sure that you have healthcare officials, and you need to make sure you have enough healthcare providers and healthcare officials that make you want to stay in a region of the state. You need those educators, so teachers. You need good schools to keep people in a certain region of the state, and as well as business. You need to make sure you have local businesses as well that are able to employ people to keep them in a specific area. So I think education is certainly part of the puzzle. I think, again, it's a combination of issues that they want to address via this commission, but education is one they specifically address by name. So they did not ignore education as something that they want to view and talk about as one of the lead issues for this commission.
As you mentioned, this was a bipartisan bill. However, I am curious as to what challenges you foresee for this, as, again, we've seen a lot of bills come up and not go through. So I'm just curious what you think this specifically could run into issues with.
That's a really good question. I think it's still somewhat early enough in the process to ultimately determine, again, what the exact hurdles will be. But I can say I think the reason why they're rather optimistic, at least from the press conference, is that you had Republicans and Democrats alike speaking on behalf of this bill in one chamber. For those who aren't familiar, right now the state house is a Democratic majority by just one. They have a one-seat majority in the state house. The state Senate is a Republican majority. However, State Senator Gene Yaw, who represents a rural county, a rural section of the state, he also spoke, positively about this legislation. So it seems as though, again, you have both sides of the aisle seemingly agreeing on it. I didn't say this was not unanimous, just to be clear. It's not as if every single member is going to vote on this in favor of this necessarily. But since it did pass with in bipartisan fashion, you had the chair, the Democratic chair, and the Republican chair of that committee both talk about what they view as the main things they want to address with it. And even if they may have different focuses, they both think that it's a commission that they believe would certainly benefit the rural parts of the state. To be determined on what the exact hurdles will be, but I think, as we know in government, there's so many issues going on. So I think maybe one of the big hurdles could just be that there's so many issues they want to tackle that there's a lot on their plate. It's they have to go one by one on some of these issues. So we'll see how much they make it a priority. That is something that'll be interesting to monitor in the coming months. Is that will they take this up quickly, or will this be something maybe they think can wait a bit, tackle some other issues that they view as more pressing, and then eventually tackle it?
You actually just kind of brought up something I want to transition into the next topic, which is the election cycle. Mm-hmm. You just brought up how there is only a one-seat majority in the House for Democrats, so that really doesn't give it a feeling of we're going to have a one-sided House, right? This is very much this election. It's at stake whether it will be Republican-controlled or whether it be Democrat-controlled. And I'm curious, due to the turnout of the primaries and the candidates elected, I'm wondering if you see any patterns going into this November for what the new Pennsylvania State House could look like.
Yeah, so the primary election, I think you can take certain data from it and think maybe it can translate to the general. But again, it's worth noting that in Pennsylvania, let's start off with, we have a closed primary system, in which Democrats can vote in Democratic primaries. If you're a registered Republican, you can vote in Republican primaries. But if you're not registered with either major party, you can't. So if let's say you're registered independent, you can't vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. There's still a significant portion of the Pennsylvania's voting population that is not registered with either party. So they didn't get a chance. I mean, they could have voted on other issues, whether they were in their local township, and let's say there was something on the ballot about a local ordinance. They could vote on certain issues like that, but they weren't able to participate in the primary for whether it be president, U.S. Senate, and the statewide row offices. So that's one thing I think that's worth noting, where the voter turnout for this past primary was rather low in Pennsylvania in comparison to at least previous presidential primary elections. But I think a lot of pundits would agree that the main reason that the voter turnout was a little lower was because that essentially we already know who the two candidates for president are going to be. President Joe Biden, although having a primary, he was on the ballot, and so was Congressman Dean Phillips. And, others, you could in theory write in a candidate, but Biden is coasting towards the nomination as for the Democrats. And then former President Donald Trump right now is at a point where he's also cruising to the Republican Party nomination. He had more challengers earlier this cycle, but they have since dropped out. The one who stayed in the longest was former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. And she exited the race, I believe it was in, I want to say early March. So, it's been a while. So, usually, people are interested at the top of the ticket. Since the presidential primary wasn't competitive, maybe there's some people that stayed at home. They thought, I'll wait till November. And even another statewide race of importance is the U.S. Senate race. Senator Bob Casey, a Democrat, is seeking a fourth term in office. He was the only Democrat on the primary ballot in Pennsylvania, and the Republican he's going to face is Dave McCormick. And Dave was the only Republican on the primary ballot. So in theory, the two offices that are the highest in the state, both parties essentially had their candidates already selected. So maybe that's a reason why I can't go into detail why they decide to stay at home. But that may be a reason I've seen from many pundits explain why the voter turnout wasn't as high. I'd expect it to be higher in November. So I think to your question about what we'll see in November, I'm pretty confident that we will have higher turnout than we will in the primary. The 2020 election had a rather high turnout in Pennsylvania, and I'm expecting the same this time around because there's a bevy of races. You have, again, the presidential race between, looks very likely to be Biden against Trump. Pennsylvania will be one of the most important swing states, and if you look at various national ratings outlets like the Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, these national ratings outlets, they determine Pennsylvania as, quote, one of the toss-up states. So Democrats and Republicans seemingly are going all in for these states, and there's only out of the 50 states in the country, there's only really a handful that are really considered toss-up states because both parties seemingly think they have a real chance at winning it. And of those, quote, toss-up states, Pennsylvania is the one with the most electoral votes on the line. So I think that's why both campaigns will be very heavily invested in Pennsylvania, and I think that's why voter turnout will be higher for that. The control of the U.S. Senate is close, so I think Senator Casey's re-election bid, should he lose, I think Republicans would feel very good about their chance of retaking the Senate. And then the U.S. House, is very close. Republicans have a majority in the U.S. House, although it's a narrow one. And then in Pennsylvania state government, Republicans have a multiple seat lead, but Democrats are trying to flip that chamber, and vice versa in the state house. Only a one seat majority. Now that's where it's much more interesting because it's only a 1 seat margin. Republicans are targeting several seats because they believe they can flip that chamber back in their control. And then, of course, not to forget, there are 3 other statewide offices that people can vote for. Attorney General, Treasurer, and Auditor General are on the ballot this time in 2024 as well. So there's a ton of races. So I really expect that the general election, we will see certainly a higher voter turnout than the primary. Although in the next few months, we will see what are the issues that will bring people to the polls.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what do you think, sort of as a reporter, are going to be the top issues that you think voters are going to focus on and sort of cast their votes based on this election cycle?
Yeah, it's super interesting because the news cycle moves so quickly, and what is a story today may not be a story in a few weeks to voters. So I can at least speak to what we're seeing right now and what both sides of the aisle are discussing. I think it's pretty evident that Republicans, by and large, have discussed inflation as a big talking point, and they believe that the policies of the Biden administration have led to inflation, and they think they are going to use their economic message as a pushback on that, as well as I've seen a number of Republicans talk about crime as an issue as well. I guess the border is something they've talked at length. They certain Republicans running for office are using border security, I suppose, as a rallying point. On the Democratic side, they have stressed a lot about, again, I think they're using the economy as well, but they believe the economic numbers are rather strong, and they think that could boost Biden's chances for re-election and help elect Democrats up and down the ballot. Another key difference I would say with Democrats, it's a rally to get voters to the polls, is certainly abortion rights. We've seen this. I've covered a number of events this year in Pennsylvania, and there's going to be only more as time goes on. And when Democrats are speaking about the 2024 election, they often talk about abortion rights. So I think that's something where Republicans, I can tell you this, when I've covered, Republicans running for statewide office and even Trump, when they're doing their stump speeches, they often don't talk about Roe v. Wade being overturned. They often don't talk about abortion as an issue. Democrats are very much making it an issue they think front and center that they believe will help drive voters to the polls. So they're the ones right now I'd say look at. But again, just to stress, as time goes forward, different issues arise. I'll give you this one side note. Back in 2020, I remember first joining the Penn Live Battleground PA podcast in 2020. I believe it was February. The first time I joined their podcast, we had the exact discussion about what are the issues people were caring about in 2020. And I remember vividly, I said Republicans were talking about the economy. They believed that Trump's economy was doing well, and they're going to hammer that home. Democrats at that time were talking about health care. They really stressed that. They thought the Affordable Care Act was under attack from the Trump administration. They believed that was a good rallying point. And then a few weeks after we recorded that podcast, the coronavirus pandemic broke out. And then those issues we thought it would be about the economy and healthcare. Seemingly after the coronavirus pandemic broke out and was center stage in American politics, that kind of became the number one story in America. So I think right now, again, I think we're seeing the economy, inflation, the border, abortion rights. They're the main ones I would say right now. But again, let's not forget that in a few months, there's other international affairs that might play into the election. There might be other issues that happen. But as of now, I would say they're the main driving factors for this upcoming election.
One thing you mentioned is foreign affairs. And as we know, some of Biden's current positions on what's going on in Israel and Palestine is very unpopular. And states like Michigan, it seems people are afraid it's going to have a huge effect as the Muslim population helped Biden to win that state in 2020. I'm wondering if we could see an effect like that in Pennsylvania, where Biden may potentially lose the state due to his position on that conflict.
It's something that it's very much worth monitoring because I talked to I'm sure there are those in the audience that are familiar that even though Biden is coasting to the Democratic nomination, there are those who have been urging Democrats to, in certain states, write on their primary ballot, instead of voting for Biden, write in, quote, uncommitted, essentially as a protest vote over his policies, his administration's, policies on that ongoing war. And I've had the chance to talk to a few Democrats since the primary election, and I asked, from what you saw in Pennsylvania, are you concerned about these voters staying at home? And I actually even asked specifically State Senator Sharif Street. He's the chairman of the Pennsylvania Democratic Party. And I asked him about, are you worried about, again, to those voters who are registered Democrat who decide to not vote for Biden in the primary, even though he was unopposed? Is that a cause for concern? And he essentially told me he believes that when push comes to shove in November, those voters will not stay at home. And again, in his mind, Senator Street told me he thinks when it's Biden and Trump on the ballot, he seems to think that those Democratic voters will come home. That remains to be seen, of course. I don't have the answer to that. But at least I can say, talking to the state party chair, they think that those voters, even though they are certainly not in favor of what they may be, they have concerns with what the Biden administration is doing there right now. They think when it's ultimately between Biden and Trump, they will vote for Biden. And however, on that note, it's kind of interesting how even though Trump, again, won Pennsylvania's Republican primary with relative ease, Nikki Haley was still on the ballot, and she did rather well in some parts of the Philly suburbs. Even though she dropped out a while ago, she registered double digits, and she's been out of the race for a while. And I actually had the chance to talk to the Pennsylvania Republican Party chairman, Lawrence Tabus, 2 days after the Pennsylvania primary. there was an event in Delaware County, which is in the Philadelphia suburbs. And I asked Tavis somewhat of a similar question to Senator Street, since they both lead their respective parties in the state. And I asked Chairman Tavis, I'm like, look, you had Haley's been out of the race for a while, and there were still double digits. She still racked up double digits in some of these high population, these densely populated suburbs of Philadelphia. And I asked, like, is that a reason to be concerned? He's like, no, again, primary voters will cast their vote now. He's like, but when it comes to Biden and Trump, he believed that the Republican voters will ultimately rally around Trump. So it's an interesting phenomenon that we're seeing on both sides of the aisle, at least that during a primary, even though Biden and Trump are both going to very likely face each other, and they were essentially the only main candidates on the ballot in Pennsylvania for the primary, there was still a section of voters on both sides that said, I don't want to vote for either. And I asked both parties chairs about it. On election day, I specifically talked to Senator Street, and then 2 days after, I talked to Chairman Tavis. And they both kind of gave me similar answers. They both said, when push comes to shove, they believe their voters will come on home. That remains to be seen, but at least they're expressing that optimism to reporters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm wondering did you ask them anything about third-party candidates, specifically like RFK Jr.? Did they say similar things where they think it'll impact the other party and not our party?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think the Robert Kennedy, that's an interesting angle as well, because there's been polling out there where I'm sure again, polling is just it's referred to as like a screenshot in time, where you post a poll 1 week and then a few weeks later that poll in theory is outdated. But one thing has been pretty certain as we look through the past few months, Biden and Trump have been consistently close. There may be some polls where Biden's up in Pennsylvania and there's some where Trump's up. But I think the one big takeaway is they're close. And when you have potential third-party candidates can play, I don't know if spoiler is the right word, but they can have an impact. Think about how close the margins were in Pennsylvania in 2016 and 2020. Less than 100,000 votes in both times. I believe it was 40-some thousand in 2016, and in 2020 it was around 80-some thousand. And, if you have a third-party candidate with a high enough name ID, whether it be a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or, Jill Stein or someone else, they can take votes away. But the question is, how many will they take? And another thing that's very worth mentioning to the audience is that we don't know what third-party candidates are going to be on the primary ballot yet. They have to make the ballot. You don't just wake up one day and say, I'm running for president, I will be on the primary ballot. They need to get enough signatures and clear certain hurdles. The Biden and Trump operation are going to have zero issue getting on the ballot in Pennsylvania. But those third-party candidates, they need to go across the state and get voters to, sign on to their petitions to get on the ballot. So that is something I'm really interested to see. One, who does, what third-party candidates make it? Because if they don't get enough signatures, they don't make it. So they can run their campaign, but if they're not on the primary ballot, not on the general election ballot, they're less likely to have a role in determining, I guess, playing a spoiler role for Trump or Biden. But if they get on the ballot, there's been polling that showed, there's some polls I saw recently, I think it was Franklin and Marshall a month or two ago, that had Kennedy registering, I think, like 8 or 9%, which is not insignificant in a swing state like Pennsylvania. Now, again, that was, let's say April or March. These things can change, and we don't know if Kennedy will be on the ballot. But a third-party candidate very well can play a role because those margins are expected to be narrow in Pennsylvania. And I think both parties recognize they can't ignore the third-party candidates. I think both parties are going to, they're optimistic that the Democrats are optimistic that Democrats are going to rally around Biden when the time comes, and Republicans feel the same way about Trump. But I think it's a dynamic that is worth monitoring because, again, Pennsylvania expected to be close. These third-party candidates can play a role in ultimately determining who wins the 19 electoral votes in Pennsylvania.
I do want to ask, as it sounds like you've had multiple conversations with party leadership from both sides, specifically on the Robert Kennedy issue, is there any feeling of which side is more afraid of him or where he's going to take votes away from? As his policies, it's very across the board, and I think it's kind of an unknown factor compared to, say, someone like Jill Stein, where it's fairly obvious where she's going to take from.
That's a great point, because you're right. So Jill Stein being in the Green Party, we understand she's more apt to take from progressive voters, maybe some Democrats who don't believe that Biden's progressive enough, perhaps. Very unlikely that a Republican would be, I mean, it's possible, but I don't think it's as likely a Republican's going to cast a protest vote for Jill Stein. Kennedy, you're right, is running this interesting campaign where he was a Democrat most of his life, and I'm pretty sure when he originally announced for president, he did it as a Democrat, and then he got out of the Democratic primary and then ran as an independent. I think both parties are cognizant that he could take away from both. So I think Chairman Tavis from the Republicans specifically mentioned that Democrats need to be worried about it, but there are Democrats who have made comments that, look, some of Kennedy's positions aren't exactly in line with today's Democratic Party, and they might take away from some Republicans. It's interesting that I believe it was a few weeks ago, in one of President Biden's most recent visit in the state. He was in Philadelphia, and President Biden had an event, and who joined him on stage? Several members of the Kennedy family endorsing his candidacy. I think that's kind of and they never mentioned Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s name during his address, during the endorsement, but it seemed pretty clear that they were on stage for one reason, to show that the Kennedy name is still well known enough, I guess, in Democratic politics, where it's not like the whole Kennedy family is backing Bobby Kennedy, RFK Jr.'s candidacy. They're backing Biden, and I think that was a strategic move to get ahead of that, to say to Democrats who maybe have fond memories of the Kennedys, they might think, maybe I'll vote my protest vote for Kennedy. Most of the Kennedy family made it a point to join Biden on stage that day to vote for him. Again, it's still early to determine who they're going to take more from, but both campaigns are definitely watching it, because they need to. I think they realize that they're not going to ignore his candidacy. I've seen press releases from both parties, legitimately, in the past few weeks, that have acknowledged that Kennedy said this about this issue, he said this about this issue, trying to rile their base, saying you don't want to vote for him in theory. But again, his name ID and maybe his message will resonate with some voters that, again, whether it be a candidate like Kennedy, he could get enough votes that it could ultimately sway, who determine who wins the Pennsylvania general election. But we don't know what side is going to take more from you. I think that's something we're going to continue to monitor. Since it's only May, we'll see. Will Kennedy's message stay the same? Will he visit certain states more than others? Is he going to try to talk to certain voters? That'll ultimately, I think, determine what party I think will be more afraid that he takes more votes from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely agree that it's certainly a story to monitor going forward. And I'm curious, what specific races or storylines are you as a journalist going to be following in this lead up to November? What do you think are going to be the important things coming out?
Yeah, so again, since my job specifically is covering Pennsylvania, of course, all races are important, but of course the presidential race is something that, again, the nation has their eyes on it, but Pennsylvania, without just talking about how much we love our state, but it really is important this time around. Every election, it's important, but I think it's being recognized, as I mentioned earlier in our discussion, that national ratings outlets have mentioned there's only a handful, 5 or 6 toss-up states. So, we can even mention the conversation. So you have Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia. You could throw in a few other states, perhaps. I think there are those who believe Nevada is also in that discussion, and maybe North Carolina. There's a few others, but they're, I think, regarded as the big ones. And of those states I just mentioned, Pennsylvania has the most electoral votes. So again, Pennsylvania, and it's also, Pennsylvania also has the distinction of this. Trump won it in 2016 and Biden won it in 2020. Both candidates have won in the state. So they both have, people have voted for them in the state, and they've carried the Commonwealth before. And I think, Trump, a big part of why he won in 2016, Pennsylvania was certainly a help. And Biden certainly was a huge help that he was able to win Pennsylvania. So both campaigns are going all in for the state. We've seen both candidates visit the state on numerous occasions already, and I've been there on several visits, and I will plan to be. So I'm interested to see what parts of the state they visit. So that's something I'm really curious to see. What, Pennsylvania, there's 67 counties. It's a big state. It's not like Rhode Island. It's not just, it's people in Erie might have different issues on their mind than the voters of Philadelphia. Vice versa, maybe those in Scranton might not be thinking the same thing that voters in Greene County are, which borders West Virginia. So it's a diverse state, a diverse electorate, and I'm curious to see where they spend their time and resources. They may be I think certain counties might focus on specific regions of the state, but they understand that you can't just do well in one part of the state. You need to make sure you're talking to all 67 counties. So the presidential race, of course, is important. The race for U.S. Senate between Bob Casey and Dave McCormick is important because so right now, again, the Democrats have the White House, Republicans have the U.S. House. Democrats are essentially knotted, even right now in this U.S. Senate, or very close to that. With Joe Manchin retiring, he's the U.S. Senator from West Virginia, a Democrat retiring there. With him retiring, I think Republicans are rather confident that they're going to take that seat back. So it's a rather conservative state. So there's a few U.S. Senate races that are under the microscope can determine ultimately who controls the chamber in 2025 and beyond. And Pennsylvania is in those few states. So Casey and the race between Casey and McCormick is going to be interesting. Right now, I can at least report that they've agreed to 3 debates. We don't know the details yet. So again, just to let the audience know, and it's only May, where it's very likely that they won't debate until very much closer to the general election, probably September, October. But they agreed to 3 debates. They said one in Pittsburgh, one in Harrisburg, one in Philadelphia. So all different parts of the state trying to talk to different voters. So we'll see that race play out. And then, of course, since the U.S. House is close, there's a few congressional races that are important, and I'm assuming both of you are probably based in the Harrisburg area. The 10th Congressional District is one of the races that's very interesting. Congressman Scott Perry, former chair of the conservative House Freedom Caucus, seeking re-election. Democrats have put up candidates the past few elections. Some races have been closer than others, I believe. Perry's closest re-election was in recent memory was 2018. He beat Democrat George Scott by just a few points. But beyond that, those races have been usually single digits. Democrats have picked their candidate, Janelle Stelson, who was a former anchor at WGAL. And so the Stelson-Perry race should be interesting. Both candidates are capable of raising a good amount of money, so we'll follow that one. The PA1 is a congressional race that's important. That's Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. He represents Bucks County, which Fitzpatrick has the distinction of being the only Republican in Pennsylvania's congressional delegation that represents a district that voted for Biden. So he has to talk, he can't go alone just Republican voters. He needs to win over Democrats there. He's the chair of the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan caucus. So he's facing Ashley Ehas, a Democrat. She's a veteran. She ran against him in 2022. Fitzpatrick won by several points. I believe it was close to 10 or maybe 10 points. But this time around, Ehas is against her second campaign. And she feels a little more optimistic this time, even though, and again, since Biden's on the ballot, Biden won that district last time. We'll see if there's a down ballot effect, and we'll see if Biden wins that district once again. PA7 is interesting, which is in the Lehigh Valley. Susan Wild is running again. She is a Democrat, and that is very much a battleground. Some would refer to it as like purple, where you have your fair share of red and blue voters there. She'll be facing State Representative Ryan McKenzie. I expect that race will get a lot of attention, and I think ultimately that will be one of the races that, again, because she won in 2018, 20, and 2022, but she's had close races each time. She's won by just a few points, so that's one that Republicans are really targeting. And then in Northeast PA, you have Congressman Matt Cartwright running for re-election. He has the distinction of being the only Democrat in the state's congressional delegation to represent a district that Trump won. Trump won that district, those boundaries in 2016 and 2020. So Republicans are certainly targeting it because Trump has fared rather well there. And it's also interesting because that district includes Scranton, where President Joe Biden was born and spent at least the first 10 years or so of his life there. But Cartwright will be again running for re-election. He is facing Republican Rob Bresnahan, so that's one that we're keeping an eye on as well at the Capitol Star. And then, of course, again, Attorney General, Treasurer, Auditor General, all important statewide races. And then the State House, again, it's a very, one seat majority for Democrats. So, very well, or in theory, if Republicans take that back and hold on to the majority in the Senate, leading into 2026, their big message will be, when Shapiro will be up for re-election in 26, I'm sure their message will be, if they flip the governorship, they would have they would try to have all three chambers. Right now we have divided government in Pennsylvania. Or, heck, there's a possibility that Democrats could flip the Senate. It's a taller task because they have more seats to flip. But maybe Democrats, the Democrats are certainly trying to flip the state Senate. And if they do, that means in 2025 they would have and if they hold on to the majority in the Senate and the House, Democrats would have the governor's mansion, they'd have the state house and the state Senate. So a lot on the line there, and these margins are rather close in Pennsylvania. And again, there's a lot there for voters. So no matter what part of the state you're in, some might have more race on the ballot that might be closer, but there's a ton to vote on. And certainly would encourage voters, in November to go to the polls. I think it'll be interesting because, again, the primary election, voter turnout wasn't that high, but I do expect it to be higher in November.
One thing I do want to ask about is actually going back to the Senate election. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned West Virginia is probably going to go Republican with the Joe Manchin seat. And last time the Senate was up was Fetterman and Oz, and the Republicans were quite confident in Oz's ability. However, one of the key factors to him losing was the fact that he is not from Pennsylvania and from Jersey. So this time they put up a candidate who was unopposed, ran last time, in Dave McCormick, who's a native Pennsylvanian. And I'm wondering if you could see maybe more support now going to McCormick versus Oz due to the Pennsylvania nativism, or if Casey's kind of name recognition will still hold value over this new candidate.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting race because in 2022, when it was then Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman against Mehmet Oz, it was an open seat. So even though both, I'm sure voters across the state knew both, but it was a wide open seat. This time, Senator Casey, to, I guess, his advantage, he's an incumbent. And there is something regarded as like the power of incumbency. He's got name recognition. He's been in office. He's been in the U.S. Senate since 2006. It's a long time. And to voters who are older, maybe not in my age or your age range, they would remember his father, Bob Casey, being the governor of the state. So the Casey name is well known in Pennsylvania to voters of a certain age, let's say. McCormick, again, this time he had the benefit of at least so when Oz got out of that primary in 2022, it was a very close race. To those who remember, Oz won that primary by less than 1,000 votes over McCormick. And it was close, and they had to spend a lot of time and resources fighting each other. Since McCormick was unopposed, he had the past few months, he could kind of look forward to the general election. He didn't have to worry about a primary battle. And to McCormick's credit, he's been able to raise a good amount of money, and he's also independently wealthy. So he's able to inject a couple million already at this point into his campaign, which is no small number. McCormick does have roots in the state. You're right, he grew up, born and raised in the state. However, he's, the residency issue is something that's actually going to play out this time around. To what degree remains to be seen. But the Casey campaign, by and large, has made an issue of residency because McCormick hasn't lived in Pennsylvania his whole life. He did grow up here, born and raised, went to grade school, high school, etc. Then he went, joined the Army, and of course went to West Point. And then, he had a long career in government. He worked in the Bush administration, sort of business career. But he was living in Connecticut for a good chunk of time. And he lived up in Connecticut for a while up until the past few years. And he still makes trips there, I think, a decent amount. He's acknowledged it because I think I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he still has one daughter that's in high school there. So I think he still goes, of course, and visits, her. But point being, residency, maybe, I don't know if it's going to play out the same way it did in 2022 because Oz really didn't have the same roots at all in the state, I guess, because Oz grew up in Delaware. And I guess to the extent of Oz's residency in Pennsylvania, he went to college at Penn, so I guess he could at least claim he went to college here. But beyond that, he wasn't really, again, he was living in New Jersey. Democrats are making it an issue. Again, look at the Casey campaign and others where McCormick hasn't been in Pennsylvania. Again, he grew up here, but he spent a good amount of the past decade or plus or so in Connecticut. So, though it's an issue where Casey's got name ID, which will help him, and I know he's going to use McCormick's recent Connecticut residency as a pitch against him. However, again, McCormick's been able to raise a good amount of money so far, so we'll see. I don't know how often either of you watch TV, but we've already seen both campaigns are on television with ads. So it kind of goes to show you, and you're thinking, like, it's May. Why are both candidates on TV already? it's going to be an expensive race. Both candidates are capable of raising a lot of money, and I think they're going to do so. And I think they're going to be on television for a while because this should be an interesting race to follow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's the whole issue of Dave McCormick trying to paint himself as sort of like a rural farm guy, bringing himself up from his bootstraps, and then that was sort of debunked, very recently. So it'll be interesting to see if, sort of rural voters sort of take issue with him trying to portray himself as one of their own when he's not really that kind of a person.
It'll be interesting because I think traditionally speaking, look at the rural counties in the state. They, by and large, vote, Republican. That's not to say every person in rural America or rural Pennsylvania doesn't votes that way. But I'm saying you look at the vote tallies in your rural counties. Republicans tend to do well there. It'll be interesting to see, again, how he does in those areas because when Trump won the state in 2016, he did so by racking up massive numbers in these rural areas. And you know what? The last time a Republican won a U.S. Senate race in Pennsylvania was 2016, and that was Pat Toomey was the incumbent senator at the time. And and here's a fascinating note. So Trump and Toomey both won in 2016 in Pennsylvania. They're both Republican. However, they both they had somewhat different paths to winning. Trump put up massive numbers in these rural areas and didn't do so well in the suburbs, but he still won. Toomey, on the other hand, didn't do as well as Trump did in the rural areas, but Toomey did pretty decent for a Republican, pretty well in the suburbs. And I even had a chance to ask Senator Toomey. I saw him, I guess it was a month ago or so, maybe a little more. Toomey was campaigning with McCormick. They were in Philly at Gino's making cheesesteaks. And I had the chance to talk to Toomey because, I kind of asked, and I posed the question to him, you and Trump had different paths to victory in 2016. You both won the state, but you didn't do it necessarily with the same electorate. And Toomey acknowledged and he agreed. He's like, yeah, we spoke to different voters. He thinks McCormick, in his mind, he had confidence in McCormick because he believes those rural and those conservative voters, he thinks they won't vote for Casey. And again, that remains, we'll see what happens. But he seems to think that those Trump voters will ultimately vote down ballot for him. And and in Toomey's words, he thinks that McCormick can outpace Trump because he thinks he'll do better in the Philadelphia suburbs, the suburbs of Western PA, even the suburban voters, and there's suburban voters in Harrisburg as well, in that Harrisburg region. So they seem to, Toomey seemed to make the pitch to reporters that McCormick and Trump, although they're both endorsing each other, Trump's endorsed McCormick, McCormick's endorsed Trump. But Toomey and some other pundits seem to think they may, maybe they might run somewhat different candidacies in the sense that maybe one will do better in certain regions. And the rural area is something I'm certainly keeping an eye on because Trump, in 2016, he would not have won Pennsylvania if not putting up those massive numbers in the rural parts of the state. So we'll see, again, how he fares this time with it and how well can McCormick do there. Because if he can't do well enough in those rural areas, if Casey cuts into those leads a bit, it'll be tough for him to unseat Casey.
One thing I do want to ask, as you mentioned, Trump this time endorsed McCormick. Mm-hmm. Do you think the fact that before McCormick was quite upset that Trump endorsed Oz, do you think that's going to have any effect or would be used as an attack point for McCormick?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess the background there. So 2022, there was a competitive Republican primary to take over Senator Toomey's seat. And it actually wasn't just a race between Oz and McCormick. There were other candidates in it. Kathy Barnett, I think, actually even registered 20% or so of the vote, or at least 15. She actually did rather well too. But Republican primary voters, Trump is popular in the Republican Party, and that race was neck and neck, and Trump endorsed Oz, and it got him over the finish line. You do wonder if he didn't endorse Oz, would Oz have won that primary? Who knows? In 2024, right now, McCormick had a clear path to the nomination. He was the only one on there. And it was interesting because months ago, it was early in, I want to say January, McCormick was on a call with reporters and I was on this call. And someone asked him, are you going to endorse in the Republican Party primary for president to McCormick? And at the time, this is when Trump had a competitive primary. This is when Nikki Haley and others were in the race. And McCormick said at the time, I'm not planning on endorsing anyone before the primary. And I think he didn't endorse Trump until it was legitimately the day, I think it was the day after, or very shortly after, Haley announced that she was no longer in the race, is when McCormick endorsed Trump because there was no other Republicans in the race. So McCormick eventually came around them. And then Trump eventually returned the favor and endorsed McCormick. This was, he actually made the endorsement. I was at the rally. It was in the Lehigh Valley. This was, I don't know if it was either late March or early April, in which Trump held a rally, and during his hour-long speech, he made a point to say, and vote for Dave McCormick. That's going to be one of the most interesting things to see is Pennsylvania voters, by and large. I know most people, usually when in a close election, I think usually it's expected that if the president wins, so will this U.S. Senate candidate from their party. That's not always the case in Pennsylvania. Again, there are those who split their ticket. They might vote different down ballot. And I can already tell you what's been a campaign issue thus far in the U.S. Senate race is that Senator Casey has been linking McCormick to Trump for most of the campaign, saying in his words that McCormick will be fighting for the MAGA agenda and he will just be, supporting the Trump policies. And let's go to the McCormick's campaign. The whole time thus far, the McCormick campaign has made a big issue saying they've been saying that Casey votes with Biden 90% of the time. He's essentially, when you vote for Casey, you're voting for Biden. So both candidates have already made the issue. They're trying to link the other to the top of the ticket. And that's interesting because you're not necessarily going to see that in every state, but in certain swing states, you'll see that. In Pennsylvania is one of them where McCormick's trying his best to tie Casey to Biden, and guess what? Casey's trying his best to tie McCormick to Trump. So that'll be interesting to follow to see how many voters will vote straight tickets. So will they vote, Democrat all down the line, or will they vote Republican all down the line? Or you have your voters that split their ballot. Now, in 2020, when Biden won, he's a Democrat and won the White House. And Josh Shapiro was the Attorney General at the time. He won his re-election bid over Republican Heather Heidelbaugh. But guess what? The Treasurer and the Auditor General race both went to Republicans. Stacey Garrity is the incumbent Treasurer. She defeated incumbent Democrat at the time, Joe Torsella. And, she didn't have nearly the funds that Torsella had, but a Republican won that race. And Tim DeFore, the Auditor General race was an open seat. It was previously held by Eugene DePasquale, who's actually running for Attorney General this time. That was an open seat in 2020 between, that was Tim DeFore, who was the Dauphin County Controller, and Nina Ahmad from Philadelphia. And DeFore won that. So point being, in 2020 in Pennsylvania, a Democrat won the White House and a Democrat won the Attorney General's office. However, for Treasurer and Auditor General, the Republicans won those races. So we'll see if there is a possibility or a world in which Biden or Trump could win the state, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the same part, McCormick or Casey will win just because the top of the ticket won. There are people who do split their ticket in Pennsylvania.
You mentioned Treasurer, and I kind of want to talk, as you mentioned, Democrat had lost that time. And in the primary, we had a Democrat who was endorsed by Casey, as well as Joanna McClinton, Speaker of the Pennsylvania House, and lost. And I want to know if you think that that could potentially hurt the Democrats' chance at gaining that treasurer seat, or if this shows maybe the voters have a different feeling of support for a certain candidate.
Yeah, the treasurer, so it's interesting. In this past primary election, I think a lot of the reporters and pundits alike would say one of the biggest surprise or takeaway results was the treasurer primary. So the Pennsylvania Democratic Party, at their endorsement meeting in the winter, endorsed a couple candidates for statewide office. They endorsed Biden, of course. They endorsed Casey, who's unopposed. And in the Auditor General race, they endorsed Malcolm Kenyatta over then I guess it was Mark Pensley, the Lehigh County Controller, and State Rep Mark Rossi at the time was a candidate but dropped out. But in the Treasurer's race, they endorsed State Representative Ryan Bizzarro, a Democrat who was from the northwest region of the state, Erie County. They endorsed him over Democrat Erin McClellan, who's from Western PA, small business background. She's run for office on different offices on multiple occasions. But the state party endorsed Bizarro. And one thing that's worth noting about the state party endorsement process, because I was even in the room for this in Harrisburg, to get the state party endorsement for Democrats, you need 2/3 of state party members, like delegates. So it's not a simple majority. And if you're a Republican, in the PAGOP, to get the state party endorsement, you need a simple majority, I think, +1. And the Democrats, you need 2/3. So Bizarro racked up a significant amount of support and had that. However, he still lost the primary to McClellan. I think it was a surprise because usually the endorsed candidate by the state party wins a statewide primary, but that didn't play out. However, since those results happened, we've seen Democrats rally around McClellan. It's not as if they're giving her the cold shoulder. They're embracing her because in their mind, Democrats are trying to unseat Stacey Garrity. So whether it was Bizarro or McClellan, they were going to back the Democrat. But that was one of the more surprising primary results, if not the most surprising result from the primary election, because it's not the state party. The state party endorsement doesn't mean everything, but it's noteworthy, like you said. Bizarro had the House Speaker's endorsement and a bunch of other notable Democrats, but Democratic primary voters felt differently, and McClellan will be the candidate. So that's interesting, I think. But Democrats are now rallying the troops around McClellan. But it will be interesting to see, what kind of role will that, what kind of impact will that have for November.
I just want to change gears slightly as we sort of come to the end of this and just sort of talk about, your job as a journalist, and the media and journalism in general has sort of come under a lot of scrutiny, and his trust has sort of been lost with different sectors of the population. So I'm wondering if journalists and the media, how are you working to try and gain back that trust of voters and people that are looking at the news and trying to figure out who they should vote for, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a good and fair question where, I think every journalist, to the best of their ability, who is doing their job the right way, is joined to, again, essentially do their best to keep their head down and do their job. And as corny as it may sound, let the work speak for itself. You know what I mean? As long as you're putting out good stories, hopefully people will recognize that. Certainly, and I think that requires talking to voters from all backgrounds. That requires going to various events to get people's perspective. And I think that's something that's important. It's a responsibility that journalists have. And certainly I think all journalists feel is that to regain trust, you just want to make sure you're hearing people and accurately representing them in the right, in the accurate way, to make sure that, so they know that, look, we're not out for either side. We're trying to truly portray what is happening, and so people can be informed. And my hope, again, we'll see how it all plays out. My hope is that, that we can, journalists can regain the trust of those who are skeptical, and hopefully that, that. Unfortunately, I know there's misinformation from that can be spread, and hopefully that the right information is getting out there to the voters and journalists. Certainly no journalist is perfect, to be clear. I'm not saying every journalist is perfect. Not every story written by a journalist is perfect, but hopefully this cycle journalists do their best, myself included, at portraying everything as we see it. Somewhat being like an umpire in baseball, calling balls and strikes, no matter what team it may be for. It's your job to play referee in that sense, and it's our job to, again, call it as we see it, and hopefully we do that to the best of our ability, and hopefully the American electorate by and large recognizes that, and hopefully we can start to regain that trust, because I think it's a legitimate concern that I think I'm sure, and if anything, I'm curious for young reporters that are pursuing let's say a job in the industry. I mean, I'm only 29 years old, so look, I was only in college not even a full decade ago, and I could tell you, coming up, these discussions were happening. I was in college and during the 2016 election, and I was covering some of these events in person, Trump and Hillary Clinton at the time, and there was discussions even then about how do we get people to regain the trust, or how do to get people to trust them, trust our reporting, and that's something that's persisted. And I don't think it's a brand new issue per se. Might I add? It's not like, I don't think this happened just yesterday. It didn't happen just in 2016. I think the hope is that as time progresses, as long as we're doing our job to the best of our ability, that's all you can do. But hopefully, we can, certainly earn the trust of the people who are reading what we're doing, and hopefully inspire others who are young and interested in the field not to feel let down or dismayed by the current state of journalism. Hopefully they feel encouraged to join the field. I think it's rewarding work, and it's enjoyable. to those who have a passion in it, you know. And I understand there's skepticism from some to, you know, whether they want to join it or not. I think, you know, it's still a really rewarding profession, and I hope to young reporters out there. Again, I was in college not even a whole decade ago, and I remember having those questions, and I was like, do I really want to pursue this? And you deal with those questions about, you know, hopefully people you know, as long as you're doing your job to the best of your ability, I think, you know, by and large, you'll build up enough goodwill that people will respect you in your field.
I do want to say I've read some of your articles, and I think you personally, at least, have remained unbiased and reporting the facts, which, when you're trying to make a decision about who to vote for, is what you need. You just need to know who the candidate is, what they stand for, not whether the specific reporter thinks that's a good thing or bad thing. So I want to thank you for doing that as part of your job, and I want to thank you for joining us, as you've really brought in some good insights on what's going on in Pennsylvania. As you'll turn on CNN or Fox News, you can easily listen to what's going on Trump or Biden, but I feel we need more people talking about down the ballot, as those are the elections that do decide what happens. I mean, we have local school boards making decisions about certain identities, and those are local elections. We have state legislature, which will either help or hurt rural Americans making those decisions. So I really do think it's important that we have reporters out there talking about what's going on locally. So I want to thank you for what you do reporting, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you a lot. It's a fun conversation. Again, whenever you need me again in the future, before the election, certainly willing to join from the PA angle, because don't forget, again, Pennsylvania as the Keystone State will be important this time around, and we will see lots of coverage. It will be a busy few months, so I'm gearing up for it. I think, you know, we're just under, I guess, officially 6 months until the general election, and until then, there is a lot of things to cover, and we're going to try our best to do it at the Capitol Star. And I know there's a lot of other amazing journalists in Pennsylvania that are doing the same that I read on a daily basis. So it's going to be an interesting 6 months, and it'll be a lot, but it'll be it'll be a very interesting time here in the state of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Sam said. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everyone joins us next time for Next Gen PA.
Next Gen PA is a podcast from the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. For more information on the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, visit our website at wacharrisburg.org.